In the middle of a barren desert where no life dares to breathe, a dying lion cub, starving, injured, barely alive, collapsed at the doorstep of an old man who once lost his arm to a lion. He should have ended it right there. But when the cub's eyes met his, something shattered between past and present. That single decision set off a chain of events so unbelievable, so deeply human, it would leave the world speechless by the end. The desert had gone quiet in a way that unsettled even those who had lived with it for decades. In the Tsochab, silence was never empty. It carried weight, memory, and warning. That night, the wind dragged thin ribbons of sand across the rocks, scraping them together like old bones. Inside a weather-beaten wooden shack near an abandoned mining pit, Elias Cole sat alone, listening to the sound of his own breathing and the slow ticking of a kerosene lantern. Elias had lived there for 12 years, long enough to learn that the desert never gave anything freely, long enough to know that survival, like good health insurance or long-term care planning, was something you only appreciated after you nearly lost it. His left sleeve hung empty at his side, pinned neatly to his jacket. He never spoke about the arm. The desert already knew that story. Just as he began to rise from his chair to lock the door against the night cold, a sound reached him, so faint he almost mistook it for the wind, a soft, uneven rasp. Then again, not the cry of a jackal, not the bark of a hyena. This was something else, something struggling. Elias froze. Out here, curiosity could cost you your life. He had learned that lesson the hard way years ago, when a single moment of distraction had ended, with teeth, blood, and a permanent settlement with pain no legal claim or compensation could ever truly cover. Still, the sound came again, weaker this time, as if whatever made it might not survive another minute. He reached for his rifle, then stopped. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the door. Cold air rushed in. Moonlight spilled across the sand, pale and unforgiving. At first he saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted, and his breath caught in his throat. At the base of the wooden steps, half buried in sand, lay a lion cub, not just any cub. Its fur was unnaturally pale, almost silver in the moonlight, streaked with dust and dried blood. One hind leg lay twisted at an angle that made Elias's stomach tighten. The cub's ribs showed with every shallow breath, each rise of its chest more labored than the last. Its eyes, glassy and unfocused, flickered toward him without fear. Only exhaustion. The cub did not growl. It did not try to crawl away. It simply breathed, as if that alone required all the strength it had left. Elias felt something stir in his chest, sharp and unwelcome. He had not seen a lion this close since the night that changed everything. That night came back now, uninvited. The roar in the dark, the weight slamming into him, the sound of bone breaking beneath a jaw built for killing. He remembered the hospital lights weeks later, the paperwork, the quiet discussions about permanent disability, about medical costs, about how life narrows after trauma. He remembered promising himself he would never be this close again. Yet here he stood. The cub's breath faltered, then steadied. A thin whimper escaped its throat, barely louder than the shifting sand. Elias noticed the wounds then. Deep punctures along the shoulder, claw marks across the flank. This was not an accident. This was what happened when a pride changed hands, when mercy had no place in nature's rules. Somewhere in the dark hills beyond the shack, something moved. Elias felt it before he saw it, the pressure of being watched. He lifted his gaze slowly, scanning the ridgeline. For a brief moment, two pale shapes stood against the rocks, then one melted back into the darkness. The other remained, motionless, eyes reflecting the moon. A lioness. She did not approach. She did not retreat. She simply watched. Elias understood then. The cub had not wandered here by chance. It had been brought as far as it could be brought, left at the only place where its mother could no longer protect it, but also could not abandon it completely. This was not surrender. It was a final calculation, as precise as any risk assessment, any decision made when all other options were gone. The wind shifted. Sand stung Elias's face. The cub shuddered, its breathing turning ragged again. If he closed the door now, the desert would take care of the rest. That was the simplest path. No danger, no memories reopened, no consequences. But Elias did not move. He set the rifle down against the wall. Slowly, carefully, he knelt. The cub's fur was warm beneath his remaining hand, too warm. Infection, fever. Time was running out. He thought of all the things people insured against, homes, vehicles, futures, and how none of it meant anything when life slipped away in front of you. The lioness on the ridge lowered her head. Elias exhaled once, long and steady. Then he lifted the cub, cradling its fragile weight against his chest. The cub did not resist. Its head fell limp against his jacket, heartbeat fluttering weakly beneath his palm. Inside the shack, the lantern flickered as Elias laid the cub on a blanket near the stove. Outside, the desert watched in silence. For the first time in many years, Elias Cole made a decision that had nothing to do with survival alone. He chose to intervene, and in doing so, he set into motion a chain of events that would reach far beyond that night, beyond the shack, beyond the desert, and into a reckoning no one, human or lion, could have predicted. The wind had calmed by morning, but the sky remained the same pale, brittle blue that often draped the Sawchab Desert. Sunlight slipped through the warped slats of the old mining shack, glinting off the rusted metal tools hung carefully on the far wall. Inside, the air still held the faint sting of antiseptic, if such a thing could still be called that, given the bottle was older than most people in town. Edgar sat on the wooden stool beside the makeshift bed, barely breathing. The lion cub lay curled in the torn wool blanket he had pulled from the storage chest. Its ribs rose and fell in shallow, uneven patterns, and the wound across its hind leg still oozed. Infection had already taken hold. The smell confirmed it, the kind of infection that didn't wait around for mercy. He reached down and gently pressed the edge of a cloth to the wound. The cub twitched but didn't cry. It hadn't made a sound since last night. Just breathing. Just surviving. Edgar had seen that kind of silence before. 40 years in the desert did strange things to a man. When he first came to Namibia to work the copper veins that ran beneath the southern ridges, he was full of strength and pride. Now, in the weight of 73 years, he was mostly skin, scar, and salt. And ghosts. 10 years ago, a lion had taken half of his left arm just below the shoulder. He'd been working near a dried-out ravine when the animal appeared from nowhere, blood on its mane, foam at the mouth. It wasn't hunting. It was angry, starved, cornered. Edgar never forgot the speed of it, the blur of muscle, and the sound of bones snapping like dry twigs. The government airlifted him out. He spent 6 months in a Johannesburg hospital learning how to write again with his right hand. Everyone told him to move home, back to the States. But he didn't. He bought out the last rights to the abandoned mine and stayed behind, alone. He hated lions. And now here he was, nursing one back from death with trembling hands and expired antibiotics. The irony wasn't lost on him. He stood and paced slowly, bones creaking. The shack was small, but every inch was a world away from the rest of the desert. On one side, maps of aquifers and old mineral lines pinned to the wall. On the other, a small solar panel converter powered a battered laptop and a battery-run fridge. In that fridge were 3 things: an old vial of penicillin, a backup insulin pen, and a small package of raw meat he'd been saving for emergencies. He opened it now, not for himself. Slicing the meat into thin pieces, he carried it over and held one up to the cub's nose. It didn't move. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, golden brown, not red like some albino lions he had seen, but there was no recognition. "I didn't ask for this," Edgar muttered. The cub blinked slowly, barely breathing. He sighed and sat again, feeding it piece by piece. He told himself it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't live another night. But in the deep part of his chest, something cracked when the cub took a third piece on its own and swallowed. That night, the wind returned. Not with the fury of the night before, but enough to rattle the broken window frames. Edgar couldn't sleep. He sat by the door with his rifle, eyes fixed on the horizon. Something had been watching them. He had seen the glint on the dune. A silhouette too still to be random. Not a jackal, not a scavenger. This was something else. And he knew what. She had followed her cub here. The lioness had not come closer, hadn't roared or paced, just watched and waited. He didn't know how long she had tracked the cub, didn't know if she had been forced to abandon it or if this was something more deliberate. But he knew what that kind of gaze meant. It wasn't aggression, it was fear, fear laced with hope. He poured himself a cup of coffee, too bitter, too black, and sipped slowly, glancing toward the covered window. His mind wandered back to his late wife, to the son they lost, to the silence that followed all tragedies. The kind that eats years without being noticed. Somehow the lioness's silence reminded him of that. Before dawn he rose and checked the cub again. Fever still clung to its tiny body, but the leg was draining properly now. He applied a new bandage and whispered to himself as he worked, a ritual born from loneliness. Then he saw it. Outside the door, lying perfectly centered on the flat rock, a hair, neck broken cleanly. No bite marks, no blood. Fresh. He scanned the ridges. Nothing, but she had been here, she had brought it, a mother's gift, and he, who had lost nearly everything in this same desert, found himself lowering to one knee before the offering. Not in worship, not in submission, but in some strange ancient recognition. This wasn't just instinct. This was a message. By noon he fed the cub again, this time mixing bits of hair into the meal. It ate better, weak but determined. Edgar cleaned the wound one more time and noted the swelling had gone down slightly. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled easily anymore. But his eyes softened. For the first time in years, the air inside the shack didn't feel stale. It felt watched, not threatened, just acknowledged. Later that day, while checking the solar battery outside, he found a set of tracks. They weren't from the night before. These were newer, close. She had come to the window. She had peered inside. He stared at the tracks for a long time, then turned and muttered, "You shouldn't trust me." But deep down, he knew trust was already given. That evening, as the sun painted the desert in deep gold, the cub let out a sound. Barely more than a whimper. But it was the first time it had made any noise. Edgar rushed to its side, unsure whether it was pain or effort. The cub's eyes were open wide, and for a second Edgar swore it was looking directly into his soul. He whispered gently, "You're not supposed to be here." But the desert had always been full of things not supposed to be. Before sleeping, he gathered his tools and quietly built a small shade outside the shack using spare cloth and copper pipes. Just enough for a mother to sit and watch. Just enough to keep the sun off her back if she returned. And she would return. He knew it now. Just as he knew the cub was going to live. Somehow. He didn't ask for this. But perhaps it was what he needed. In the digital world, where people chase miracle cures and pet insurance plans, where search engines are flooded with terms like veterinary emergency care, critical illness coverage, or pet health savings account, no one ever imagined a one-armed man in the desert spending his last vials of medicine on a dying lion cub. And yet, here he was, and the world had no idea what was about to unfold. By the time the third morning rolled over the desert, the heat had already begun to crawl along the ridges like something alive. The copper light stretched across the sand, casting long shadows from every stone and withered bush. Inside the mining shack, Edgar sat quietly, holding his breath as he watched the cub sleep. Its breathing was steadier now. The fever had broken sometime after midnight. A thin sheen of sweat clung to its pale fur, and the swelling in the injured leg had gone down noticeably. Edgar had seen enough death in his life to recognize when something turned, and this cub somehow had made the turn. It wasn't just surviving anymore. It was fighting to live. He reached down and brushed a tiny beetle off the blanket. The cub stirred, eyelids fluttering open. This time, when Edgar met its gaze, it didn't look through him. It looked at him. Clear, focused, present. He exhaled slowly, then stood and stretched his back. Every vertebra protested. The aches that came with age were familiar, but something about this morning felt different. Lighter, as if the air itself had changed. He stepped outside, and there it was, laid out like an offering on the flat stone in front of the shack, a fresh kill. A young springbok, small but intact. The wound on its neck was precise, clean. No signs of mauling, no claw marks. This was a practiced kill. A message? He didn't need to look up to know she was near. The lioness. He scanned the distant dunes, eyes sweeping across the golden ridges until he caught it, a flicker of white, far up the hill. Still, watching, just like before. She had come back, not to take the cub, not to threaten. She had brought food, a gesture as old as time. Edgar walked slowly to the springbok and crouched. The body was still warm. The lioness couldn't have left it more than 15 minutes ago. He looked back at the shack, then up toward the ridge again. She hadn't moved. He raised his hand, not to wave, but just to show it was empty. No weapon, no threat. She watched for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared over the rise. When he brought the kill inside, the cub's head lifted at the scent, weak but alert. Edgar carved off strips and fed them slowly, watching as the young lion swallowed with increasing strength. It wasn't just eating now, it was hungry. For a man who had spent decades alone in a desert cave of grief and rust, Edgar suddenly found himself at the center of something profound, something unspoken. No words, no explanations. Just an injured cub, a mother lion, and an old man who had once sworn never to go near a lion again. That afternoon he dragged the remains of the springbok outside and buried them. Not because he feared scavengers, but because something about this felt sacred. He didn't want it to rot, didn't want it to be torn apart by hyenas or buzzards. Not this gift. As night approached, Edgar sat on the step of the shack, staring at the last of the sunlight sinking into the sand. In the distance, the white ridge where the lioness had stood shimmered faintly. He wondered where she was now. If she was watching again. If she would return tomorrow. And then it hit him. This wasn't a goodbye. This was a beginning. Each evening that followed, she came back. Each time she brought a different kill. A rabbit, then a ground squirrel, then another springbok, smaller than the first. Sometimes the meat was left neatly on the stone. Other times it was placed just a few feet farther, as if testing the boundary between fear and trust. Edgar never tried to close the distance. He didn't call to her. He didn't move closer when he spotted her outline atop the dune. Instead, he built a small platform near the door, shaded with canvas, where he placed clean water and meat in return. A ritual began, a rhythm, a silent agreement between man and beast, and the cub thrived. Its limp faded day by day. It began to sit up, then to crawl awkwardly across the floor. It tried to climb, to bite at Edgar's boots, to play with frayed ropes lying near the table legs. Every sound it made was soft but full of life. One morning, while cleaning the floor, Edgar heard a scratching sound behind him. He turned to see the cub standing on its own for the first time. Its legs shook, but it stood, head high, tail twitching. When their eyes met, something passed between them. Not gratitude, recognition. You're the one who didn't give up. Edgar knelt and extended his hand. The cub limped forward and brushed its head against his palm. The moment shattered something inside him. All the years of bitterness, the memories of pain, the night terrors, the phantom ache of a missing limb. They cracked, not gone, but no longer in control. Later that evening, after feeding the cub and securing the windows, Edgar sat outside again with his coffee. The stars began to bloom across the night sky, one by one. The desert had a silence unlike any other place on earth. It was deep, patient, eternal. And then he heard it. Not a roar, not a growl, a low rumbling purr from just beyond the rise. She was there, closer than ever. He didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly, but inside his chest something stirred. Respect, the kind you feel when standing before a monument or when you read the final letter of someone you loved and lost. The lioness had become more than just an animal. She was a mother, a teacher, a symbol. And every night her gifts continued. Springboks, hares, once even a large leg of oryx. Always fresh, always silent. People spoke of emotional support animals, of therapy pets that eased the hearts of the lonely, the traumatized, the forgotten. But no insurance plan, no subscription box of gourmet dog treats, no article about the best pet insurance for seniors could describe what this was. This was something the world didn't have a word for. The man who once hated lions now lived because of one, and another, her cub, was becoming his shadow. It had been 8 days since that first night, 8 days of silence and food and slow healing, 8 days since a mother laid her faith at a man's door and walked away. And tomorrow something would change again. But for tonight, under the starlight, Edgar allowed himself the one thing he hadn't felt in years: hope. The sun had barely risen when Edgar heard the faint hum of an engine in the distance. It wasn't common for anyone to wander this deep into Sawchab alone. The mine had been decommissioned for over 2 decades, and most of the maps didn't even show it anymore. Anyone showing up out here had a reason, and a good one. He stepped out from the shack, the lion cub close behind him, limping but curious. Edgar narrowed his eyes, shielding them from the glare as the outline of a white utility truck approached along the cracked trail. He could make out a single figure behind the wheel, waving as the vehicle slowed. The man stepped out, tall and wiry, with a short beard and a surveyor's bag slung across his shoulder. "You Edgar Helms?" he called out, friendly but direct. "Depends," Edgar replied flatly. "Who's asking?" "Liam McKinnon, Geological Survey Team. I was supposed to do a terrain moisture scan out near the lower basin, but we hit a snag with the solar rigs. Heard there was a retired miner still out here who might know the area better than the maps." Edgar nodded slowly. "That'd be me." Liam looked past Edgar and froze. His eyes locked onto the pale figure sitting in the shade near the door. Small, still, but unmistakable. "Is that a lion cub?" Edgar didn't respond. He simply turned and walked toward the shack. "You want water or not?" Liam hesitated, then followed. Over the next hour they talked. Liam drank slowly from an old metal cup, while Edgar gave a brief rundown of the rock formations and known dry wells around the southern ridges. But Liam's attention kept drifting back to the cub. "Where did you find it?" he finally asked. "I didn't," Edgar replied. "It found me." Liam stared. "That's an albino cub. You don't see that every day. You don't see that ever, actually." Edgar shrugged. "It's hurt. I'm helping it live." "You know it's illegal to keep wild animals, right?" "I'm not keeping it. I'm healing it." Liam didn't push the point, but the tension lingered. Edgar didn't like questions, especially from strangers. Before leaving, Liam walked over and crouched near the cub. He didn't reach out, just looked. The cub looked back, calm but distant. "Mind if I take a picture?" he asked. Edgar hesitated. "Why?" Liam raised his hands. "I run a little wildlife blog just for enthusiasts. No names, no location data. Just beauty." After a long pause, Edgar gave a curt nod. The camera clicked once, then again. Liam stood, adjusted his bag, and tipped his cap. "Thanks, Mr. Helms, and good luck." Edgar didn't reply. By dusk, the man was gone. That night, the lioness did not come. Edgar waited on the step, watching the dark horizon, but no silhouette appeared. No fresh kill was left. Only silence. Inside the shack, the cub seemed restless, pacing now, dragging its healing leg, sniffing the air. Edgar didn't sleep. He sat by the door, eyes fixed on the ridge. Something felt off. The next morning, still no sign. By noon, Edgar opened the laptop, a solar-charged relic he rarely used, and logged onto the slow, brittle satellite internet. Out of habit, he clicked over to the wildlife blog Liam had mentioned. And there it was. Front page. Ghost of the Desert, albino lion cub discovered in Namibia's deep south. There were 4 photos, the shack, the cub, and in the background, barely visible, a pale shape atop the ridge. Edgar's chest tightened. He clicked into the comments. Over 200 already. Most of them wide-eyed awe and wonder, but some. "Do you think it's still there?" "This would sell for millions on the exotic trade." "Coordinates?" "I've got trackers in the area. We'll find it." He closed the lid slowly. A cold, sick feeling bloomed in his stomach. Out here, it didn't take much for word to spread, and for people to come, people who didn't see wild animals as miracles, but as currency. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing the door, adding wooden braces and metal locks. He stashed his rifle within reach. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did the cub. It sat near the window, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the ridge. Still no lioness, but something else was coming. Around 3 in the morning, Edgar heard a sound he hadn't heard in years. A vehicle without headlights. Slow. Rolling over sand. Tires built for silence. He moved quickly, gently lifting the cub into the crawl space beneath the floorboards, something he had installed long ago to hide tools, never imagining it might one day hold something sacred. He doused the lamps and sat by the door, rifle across his lap, heart pounding. The engine cut out. Then, footsteps. 3 of them. Heavy boots. Voices in hushed tones. They didn't knock. Edgar stayed silent. Then one of them spoke, low and familiar. "Looks abandoned. Let's check the back." The voice didn't belong to a government ranger or any surveyor. It belonged to someone who had done this before. Wildlife trafficking wasn't new. The demand for exotic species, especially rare albinos, had always been a high-dollar underground trade. Articles on how to insure exotic animals or wildlife transport logistics may appear innocent on the surface, but beneath that surface lived a world of shadow. Edgar tightened his grip. Outside, something shifted. A hiss, then a growl, but not from inside the shack, from the ridge. The lioness was back, and this time she wasn't alone. A deep, rumbling snarl rolled through the darkness, followed by a scream, a man's voice, panicked and broken. Then silence. Footsteps running. The truck roared to life and peeled off into the night, spraying sand as it disappeared into the black. Edgar didn't move, didn't speak. Only when dawn broke did he open the crawl space and lift the cub gently back into the room. It looked up at him, eyes wide and unblinking. He whispered, "Your mother saved us." And somewhere, up on the ridge, he knew she was watching. The sun returned with a vengeance the following morning, casting the desert in that cruel, sharp light that seemed to show no mercy. Edgar moved slowly, every step a quiet echo of the night before. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The lion cub followed him with silent steps, no longer the frail, fevered creature that had collapsed on his doorstep. It still limped, but there was strength now, resilience in every glance. Edgar scanned the edge of the ridge with his binoculars. Nothing, no lioness, no sound, only the memory of that snarl in the dark and the way those men had fled like rats chased by fire. He should have felt safe now, relieved. But safety was a lie in the desert. 2 days passed with no more sightings. The lioness didn't return to the ridge. No fresh kill appeared, and yet Edgar couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't gone far. She was watching, waiting, measuring whether the man who had once hated lions was worthy of the trust she had offered in silence. On the 3rd morning, something felt off. The cub didn't come to the door when he whistled. Edgar walked around the side of the shack and found it sitting in the dust, staring fixedly toward the western bluff. It wasn't growling, just still, alert. Then he saw it too, a sliver of silver glinting in the sun, metal, out of place against the raw earth. Edgar grabbed his rifle and walked slowly, circling wide until the shine came into full view. It was a snare, heavy-duty steel, professionally set. His chest tightened. He followed the tracks nearby, boot prints, recent, and farther along, claw marks, blood. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Drops scattered along the rocks, fading into the sand. He moved faster now, breath shallow, pulse loud in his ears. The tracks led uphill through a pass between 2 jagged boulders, then down into a small ravine hidden from view. And there she was, the lioness, caught. The snare had locked around her front leg, digging deep into the muscle. Blood soaked the ground beneath her. Her head was low, breath ragged, but she didn't growl when she saw him. She didn't move. She just looked at him, and he froze. It hit him all at once. The scar along her jaw, the missing tooth, the eyes. It was her. The lion that had taken his arm 10 years ago, the one that had mauled him and left him broken in that very ravine, the one he had cursed every night since. This wasn't just a mother. This was her. Edgar stumbled back a step, bile rising in his throat. How could this be possible? And yet, standing there, rifle in one hand, past and present crashing together, he didn't feel rage. He felt awe. This lion had spared him once in the night. She had brought food. She had guarded the shack from poachers. And now, wounded, vulnerable, she looked at him again, not with dominance or fear, but trust. It wasn't redemption. It was something else. He dropped the rifle. The mechanism on the snare was old, but not unfamiliar. He'd seen enough of them during his younger years when protecting livestock was more important than protecting nature. It took several minutes, sweat dripping into his eyes, fingers shaking, but finally, with a loud click, the snare released. The lioness didn't move right away. Edgar stepped back, heart pounding. She lifted her head slowly, tried to rise, and stumbled. Then she lay back down again, panting. She was too weak. He couldn't leave her. He built a small barrier of rocks around her to shield her from the direct sun, then soaked a cloth with the last of his water and laid it gently across her side. She flinched, but didn't attack, didn't snarl, just breathed. And so he stayed, all afternoon. When the wind picked up again, sweeping sand across the ridge, he finally rose. "I'll come back," he said softly, though he wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe it was for her. Maybe it was for himself. Back at the shack, the cub was waiting. It limped to him, brushed its head against his good hand, then sat quietly. Edgar didn't speak. He just opened the fridge, pulled out a strip of meat, and tossed it on the floor. Then he packed a bag. water, gauze. His only remaining antibiotic syringe, a flashlight, rope. That night he returned to the ridge. She was still there, still breathing, barely. He approached slowly and injected the antibiotic into the muscle above the wound. She winced, teeth flashing, but did not strike. When he cleaned the wound, she made a sound, low and guttural, but stayed still. All night he stayed. At dawn she stood, wobbled, and then, incredibly, walked. Not far, but upright, proud. She looked back once, eyes locked on him, and disappeared into the morning haze. He didn't cry, but something inside him, something hard and cruel, broke apart. He returned to the shack, body aching, mind numb. The cub ran to him, and behind it for the first time came a second figure, a young jackal. Edgar blinked. It stood there, panting, tail low but not tucked. The cub turned, nudged it with its nose, and barked softly. They had come together, wild, silent companions. Something in the desert had connected them. Edgar opened the door. "Fine," he muttered. "All of you can stay." Inside, the cub curled near the door. The jackal lay beside it. And Edgar sat, listening to the wind. No more nightmares that night. No dreams at all. Just sleep, and the slow, steady breath of something once broken, healed. Morning came without a sound. The sky over Tsauchab was wrapped in gold and ash, and the wind was still asleep. Edgar opened his eyes to the low rhythm of paws against wood. The lion cub was already up, circling the shack's interior, sniffing the corners, checking for change. At its side, the jackal trotted quietly, ears perked but movements respectful, like a guest trying not to intrude. Edgar sat up slowly. Every bone creaked, every muscle throbbed, but none of it mattered. He stepped outside. There, at the usual stone near the front of the shack, was the first sign that the rhythm had returned. A gift, an oryx leg, freshly hunted, still warm. The kill wasn't neat like the others. There were signs of struggle, blood on the sand, deep claw marks along the thigh. But the meaning remained the same. She was alive. She had hunted again. The lioness was strong enough to run, to kill, to return. Edgar didn't smile, but his chest felt lighter. He carried the leg inside, laid it near the cub and jackal, and watched them tear at it together. No growling, no fighting, just sharing, nature's version of grace. Over the next few days, the cub grew bolder. It began stretching its legs farther from the shack, testing the slope behind the hill. The jackal followed, always staying a few steps behind. Edgar observed from the porch, rifle close, though he hadn't needed it in days. Then something changed. On the fourth morning there was no kill, no lioness on the ridge, just stillness, and Edgar felt it, that hollow silence again. But before worry could settle, a new noise broke it, something sharp and human. A vehicle. 2, maybe 3, moving faster than before. Not surveyors, not tourists. The tracks from last week had brought back something worse. By midday, he heard the buzzing of a drone. It passed low over the shack, circled once, then sped off. The cub and jackal crouched low behind the barrels, eyes alert. Edgar stood still, his expression hardening. They knew. The world out there had found them again. He moved quickly that afternoon, reinforced the shutters, moved the food supplies into the crawl space, taught the cub a soft whistle, one he used to call his dogs back in the States, decades ago. To his surprise, the cub responded every time, not out of obedience, but out of recognition. They were learning each other. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Edgar spotted movement on the ridge. Not lions, not jackals, men. 3 of them, dressed in tan, walking in staggered steps. One carried a long object over his shoulder, too straight for a shovel, a rifle. They didn't approach the shack directly. They moved parallel to it, searching the sand, tracking, looking for signs. They stopped where the lioness had once bled, studying the marks. Edgar didn't go out to meet them. He waited. That night, under a moonless sky, a figure crept close to the rear fence. Edgar heard the whisper of footsteps, then the snap of a twig. He fired one warning shot into the air. The footsteps retreated fast, swallowed by the dunes. But it wouldn't be enough. These weren't amateurs. They'd be back, better prepared, more desperate. The cub sensed it too. It stood by the window, hackles raised, ears back. The jackal growled low, a sound like gravel grinding against stone. The desert held its breath. At dawn, Edgar found a new message. Not a kill this time, but something stranger. A dead cheetah. Laid out near the edge of the bluff, its neck broken, its body untouched. He examined it closely. The wounds didn't look like lion work. No tearing, just one swift, precise blow to the spine. Something had killed it to protect the cub. He looked up. There she was, the lioness, standing higher on the ridge than ever before, majestic, watching. Behind her, barely visible, two more shapes emerged. Young lions, adolescents, likely hers, or perhaps from her old pride. They flanked her like shadows. She had not come alone this time. Edgar stepped forward, nodded once, and she nodded back. Not an illusion, not projection, but a moment of shared acknowledgement between two lives who had once stood on opposite ends of survival and now met in the middle. He turned back to the shack. The cub and jackal followed him inside. That night, he wrote in his journal, something he hadn't touched in nearly 10 years. Pages of ink poured from his hand. He wrote about fear, about forgiveness, about how nature didn't keep score the way men did, and about how sometimes the wild offers you a second chance, but never with words, only with silence. He tucked the journal under his cot and stared at the stars through the cracked slats above. No one would believe him. No one had to. But out here, deep in the desert, a lion had come to repay a debt. And she hadn't come alone. The storm came without warning. One moment, the desert was still and dry under the weight of a cloudless sky. The next, the horizon darkened like spilled ink, and the wind picked up with a sudden feral growl. Edgar stood outside the shack, his hand shielding his eyes, watching the line of sand rise like a living wall. He had lived through dozens of dust storms in his lifetime, but this one felt different. He couldn't explain why, only that something inside him stirred, a tightness in his chest, like a storm behind his ribs, mirroring the one outside. He whistled, short and sharp. The lion cub came bounding from behind the barrels where it had been sunbathing, and the jackal followed right behind, both disappearing into the shelter of the shack as Edgar secured the latches. He double-checked the windows, moved the meat supplies to the inner room, and laid out blankets along the door to block the creeping sand. Then he waited. The first gust hit hard, slamming against the structure like a wave crashing on rock. Dust poured through the cracks like smoke. Edgar pulled a cloth over his face and moved to the cub, who stood still near the back wall, eyes wide but calm. The jackal, curled tightly in the corner, whimpered low, every muscle taut. Then came the sound he hadn't expected. Voices, human, outside, muffled at first, swallowed by wind, but there. Edgar's spine stiffened. He turned off the single lamp and moved to the peephole he had carved into the door weeks ago. Shadows moved between gusts, 3 figures, hoods pulled tight, one carrying a metal case, the other 2 with long shapes strapped to their backs. He didn't need more details. They had come back, not to track, not to threaten. To take. Edgar reached under the cot and pulled out his rifle. His fingers moved without thought, muscle memory born of decades. But as he slid the bolt into place, something tugged at his mind. A question. Would he need to use it, or would the desert handle this one on its own? Outside, the wind howled louder, covering every footstep, every breath. The shadows moved closer. One reached for the side of the shack. A creak echoed, then a crack, and that was when the silence shattered. A roar cut through the storm like lightning, not from inside the shack, from the ridge, low, deep, angry. Then another, and another. The men outside froze. Edgar watched as one dropped his case, another stepped back, rifle raised, but it was too late. From the blackness, two shapes flew down the slope, pale, fast, soundless until the last moment. The first man screamed. It didn't last long. The second tried to run, but a white blur knocked him to the ground with a sound Edgar would never forget. Bone, cloth, sand. Then silence. The third man bolted, vanished into the storm. No roar followed him. He was no threat anymore. Edgar stood there, unmoving, eyes locked on the door. Then he heard it. Not a growl, not a snarl, a sound closer to breath. Heavy, steady, just outside the door. He opened it slowly and saw her, the lioness, standing tall, blood on her chest, shoulders heaving. Behind her, the adolescent lions, her companions, flanked the cub's window like sentries. And at her feet, alive, shivering and covered in dust, was the jackal. It had run out when the door opened, and she had protected it too. Edgar stepped outside, the storm beginning to ease. He knelt slowly, palms open. The lioness didn't move. Then, with deliberate grace, she turned her head to the side. Toward the cub, he stepped out, blinking through the settling dust. They faced each other, mother and child. No words, no sound. Then the cub moved. It stepped forward and pressed its head into her chest. She responded in kind, curling her neck around its small frame, pulling it close. Edgar's eyes burned. He had witnessed the return of something pure. She hadn't come just to save the cub. She had come to return it. But the cub didn't leave. It turned its head, looked back, at Edgar, and took a step toward him, then another. The lioness watched, unmoving. And then the most remarkable thing happened. She followed. Together, the cub and the lioness walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. The wind had died completely. The air was thick with heat, blood, dust, and something else. Reverence. She stepped forward and bowed her head, not low, not submissive, but in understanding. This was not her enemy. Not anymore. He was family. That night they didn't leave. They lay near the shack, the cub curled between them. The jackal slept nearby, one eye half open. And Edgar stayed on the step, rifle by his side, but untouched. The stars came out late, piercing the thinning clouds like ancient eyes. And for the first time since his injury, since the screaming hospital nights, since the bitterness that hollowed out his soul, Edgar felt peace. Not safety, not victory, but something greater. Connection. In an age where people searched endlessly online for life insurance quotes, 24-hour emergency services, and natural disaster preparedness tips, none of those things would have saved him here. Only trust did that. Only wild, wordless trust. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would come with more storms, more questions. But tonight the wild had drawn its line in the sand, and it stood with him. The desert always had a way of making time feel slower. Days didn't pass. They settled, like dust on sun-scorched stone. And after the night of the storm, after the blood and the roar and the silence that followed, the sun rose over Sawchab with a stillness that felt holy. Edgar stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the pale sky stretch itself wide. Behind him, the shack still stood, unchanged in its bones, but everything around it felt different. The lioness and her cub lay beneath the mesquite tree, side by side. The jackal sat between them, head resting on its paws, its narrow eyes half closed in the warmth. There had been no more threats, no trucks, no strangers. The wild had sent a message of its own that night, and the kind of people who understood that message rarely returned. Edgar walked slowly to the place where the lioness had once laid her first offering. The stone was still stained from past kills, but the wind had cleaned away the rest. He knelt down, placed his hand against the surface, and closed his eyes. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, but when he opened them, the cub was standing beside him. Not limping anymore, not cautious, just present. He turned to face it fully, and the cub moved closer, brushing its head gently against his shoulder. Edgar placed his hand on the animal's neck, fingers sliding through the rough, thickening mane. There was strength there now, not just survival, readiness. He looked up toward the horizon. "It's time, isn't it?" The cub didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Behind them, the lioness rose slowly. Her body bore the signs of her battles, of age and endurance, but she stood like something eternal. She gave a low call, not a command, not a farewell, just a note in the language only her kind would ever fully understand. The cub stepped back, turned toward her. Edgar felt his throat tighten. He had known this moment would come. Always. You don't get to keep what the wild lends you. You just carry it long enough to remember how to let it go. The lioness walked to him. Not quickly, not with threat, just presence. She stopped just inches away, so close he could see the web of scars along her chest, the dust in the corner of her eyes. She looked at him not as a beast looks at prey, but as one being looks at another who has paid a price. Then, without sound, she lowered her head, and he did the same. 2 worlds, 1 gesture. That was the last time he saw her. The cub lingered for a moment longer. It circled him once, rubbed its flank against his hip, and then turned. Together they walked back toward the horizon, mother and child, with the jackal trotting behind like a shadow that had chosen a different destiny. Edgar watched until the heat of the day melted their forms into the mirage. Then he went back inside. He didn't cry. There was no grief here, only the ache that comes from knowing something rare had happened, and would not happen again. Weeks passed. The ridge stayed quiet. One morning, a black SUV came rolling across the dirt path. It was Liam, the surveyor. He stepped out with a different air this time. He looked older somehow, or maybe just more careful with his words. "I heard what happened," he said softly. Edgar didn't ask how. Liam walked to the step and sat. "You kept them safe." Edgar nodded once. "They kept me alive." They talked long into the afternoon, not about science or tracking or blogs, just about the desert, about its quiet, its cruelty, and its mercy. Before Liam left, he opened the trunk of the SUV and handed Edgar a small package. Inside was a satellite emergency beacon, pre-programmed with rescue coordinates. "For the future," Liam said. "Just in case." Edgar smiled, barely. "I hope I never need it." As the SUV disappeared into the heat waves, Edgar looked back at the place where the cub had once lain, near death. The spot was empty now, but in his mind it would always be occupied. Late that night, he opened his journal again. He wrote about what cannot be measured, about how loyalty doesn't come from training, and love doesn't always wear the face you expect. He wrote about the lioness, about the way she came back even when she didn't have to, and how forgiveness never knocks before it enters. The desert cooled as the stars poured out again, thousands of them, bright and sharp against the deep black sky. Then, just before sleep claimed him, he heard it, the faintest sound, soft paws across stone. He stepped outside, heart rising. There, at the foot of the old stone, was another gift. Smaller this time, a rabbit, cleanly killed, and in the sand beside it, 2 sets of prints, one large, one impossibly small. Edgar dropped to one knee, hand against his mouth. She hadn't just said goodbye. She had passed something on, a new cub, a new beginning. He looked up at the sky, exhaled slowly. "Then I guess I'm not done yet." And the desert, in its own silent way, agreed.